Picture a small town, its quiet streets hiding decades of unspoken truths. Now add a long-awaited reunion, a missing woman, and a web of secrets stretching back to high school. In the Missing Prom Queen, the past resurfaces with a vengeance, and every smile hides a story of betrayal. Settle in, this mystery will unravel layer by layer, and the truth may be more dangerous than anyone expected. The gymnasium at Ridgeway High had been transformed for the 40th reunion, its familiar walls now lined with faded yearbook photos and decorations from decades past. The air had a musty scent of old wood mixed with faint perfume, as if time itself had lingered there. The polished wood floors, once vibrant with the energy of high school dances, reflected the blue and gold banners that hung from the rafters, their colors dimmed by years of neglect. Everything was familiar, yet distant, like stepping into a memory that had been altered by time. Laughter and chatter filled the space, but there was an underlying discomfort, a sharpness to the edges of the conversations. People greeted one another, some with open arms, others with stiff nods, unsure how to bridge the gap of decades. The reunion was meant to celebrate shared histories, but the atmosphere was thick with a sense of unease, as if everyone was quietly aware of the years that had passed and the things left unsaid. Jane Harper stood near the entrance, her gaze sweeping over the room, taking in every detail. She had retired years ago, but the reunion was as much a reflection of her own past as it was of the others. She had taught many of these people, guided them through their teenage years, and yet so much had changed. Some of them had settled into predictable roles, while others had become shadows of who they once were. Jane had always been the quiet observer, never one to seek attention, but always aware of what was happening around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the reunion was more than just a celebration of old times. It was a reckoning, an unraveling of something long buried. The door to the gym creaked open, and Claire Montgomery entered. The room seemed to pause for a moment, the conversation stalling as she made her way across the floor. Claire, once the prom queen, was still as striking as ever. The years had been kind to her, but there was something in her eyes, an unreadable distance that made her seem not quite the same as the girl they all remembered. Her entrance had the usual effect. Some smiled, others looked away, and a few exchanged quick, assessing glances. Time had softened her image in their minds, but it was clear that Claire still commanded attention without even trying. She moved through the crowd like someone who had long been used to being admired, but her aloofness now seemed more deliberate than ever. Jane watched her carefully, noting the subtle shifts in the way people responded to Claire. There was something unsettling about her presence now, something that spoke of untold stories and unhealed wounds. The reunion wasn't just a gathering of old friends. It was a stage for all the unresolved emotions from high school to surface, and Claire was still at the center of it all. Nearby, Doug Hayes stood by the refreshment table, nursing a drink, his gaze sweeping over the room. His posture was defensive, his broad shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to shrink into himself. The former football star, once the pride of Ridgeway High, had seen better days. His business ventures had faltered, and the years had not been kind to him. His jawline, once sharp and defined, had softened, and the fire that had once burned in his eyes now flickered faintly, overshadowed by a lingering bitterness. Though his glory days had faded, he still carried himself like a man who had once been admired, even if that admiration was now distant. Maggie Carter, now a local journalist, flitted through the crowd, her eyes darting from person to person. She was a constant presence, never quiet for long, always searching for something to fill the silence. Maggie had always been the class gossip, and even after all these years, that part of her hadn't changed. She hovered near the edges of the conversations, inserting herself into them with practiced ease, but her focus always seemed to drift back to Claire. Jane couldn't help but notice the way Maggie kept glancing toward her, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to piece together something she hadn't quite figured out. Gregory Lewis stood by the far wall, quietly observing. The shy, awkward boy who had once been the target of ridicule was now a successful tech mogul, but in this room, he seemed just as out of place as he had been in high school. He avoided eye contact, his shoulders hunched as though trying to remain unnoticed. The wealth he had accumulated in the years since high school hadn't brought him the peace he had hoped for. The same quiet, unsure boy lingered beneath the surface, and it was clear he still struggled with his place among these people. Linda Shaw was standing near the door, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her eyes fixed on Claire. The tension between them was palpable, though neither of them spoke a word to acknowledge it. Linda's gaze followed Claire's every move, sharp and unyielding. The weight of their estrangement hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Once, Linda had been Claire's closest confidant, but something had shattered that bond. Jane could feel the unspoken history between them, the weight of old secrets and unresolved grudges. Linda had never quite let go of the past, and it was clear that the years hadn't healed the wounds between her and Claire. As the evening wore on, the laughter and chatter rose and fell in waves, the music playing softly in the background. It should have been a celebration, but it felt more like a ritual, a meeting of ghosts who had never truly moved on from the past. Eventually, the announcement came. It was time for the prom royalty presentation. The spotlight was directed toward Claire, the woman who had been the star of that night all those years ago. The crowd went silent, awaiting her appearance. Minutes passed. No Claire. At first, the crowd assumed she had stepped out for a moment, but the whispers began. First, they were quiet, little more than murmurs, but soon they grew louder as more and more people noticed the empty space where Claire was supposed to stand. Something didn't feel right. And then Linda Shaw found Claire's purse, abandoned near the restrooms. The bag was neatly packed, as though Claire had left it there intentionally, not as if it had been lost or forgotten. Linda hesitated for a moment, looking down at the purse, unsure of whether to call attention to it. It sat there, untouched, and in that stillness, it became the first sign that something was terribly wrong. The murmurs about Claire's absence had become harder to ignore. Whispers slid through the room like a current, growing louder as the minutes ticked by. Jane stood near the edge of the crowd, nursing her drink, when she overheard a conversation that piqued her curiosity. Linda and Maggie were speaking quietly by the punch bowl, their words almost lost in the murmur of the others. Linda's voice was sharp, edged with frustration, but Maggie's tone was cool and controlled, almost too smooth, as if she were carefully selecting each word. "She wouldn't just leave," Linda said, her voice tight. "Not without saying something to me, at least. Not after everything." Maggie's response was guarded, her eyes flickering toward the door. Maybe she just wanted to slip out unnoticed. You know how Claire is, always the center of attention, but never really here, always keeping everyone at arm's length. Maggie paused, casting a quick glance around to ensure no one was listening too closely. "But I'll admit it doesn't feel right. There's something off about this." Jane felt a small ripple of unease. Maggie, as usual, was careful with her words, but there was something in the way she said it, something deliberate. She was always good at reading people, but tonight she seemed more focused on something hidden. Linda, too, was visibly shaken, but she wasn't sharing anything concrete. Her vague references to some shared history with Claire only added to the tension hanging between them. With a quiet breath, Jane excused herself from the conversation and moved toward the exit. She needed air, and something about the way Maggie's eyes had narrowed made her instinctively pull away from the crowd. Outside, the chill of the night wrapped around her, and the parking lot was eerily quiet, save for a few scattered cars. Her eyes immediately locked onto Claire's familiar red sedan parked at the far end of the lot. The headlights were still on, casting long shadows across the asphalt, but the car's doors were wide open, the keys left in the ignition. A small but significant detail. Jane moved closer, her heart skipping a beat. The sight of the car was wrong in a way that she couldn't yet articulate. Claire would never leave her car like this. She was always too cautious, too aware of her surroundings. The scene felt too staged, too deliberate, like someone had set it up to look careless when it was anything but. She leaned closer to the driver's side, her breath fogging in the cool air. Sticking out from beneath the windshield wiper was a faded reunion flyer. Jane pulled it free, her fingers brushing against the brittle paper. It was standard. just the usual event details, names of those involved in organizing the reunion, but the deliberate placement of it, so visible and yet so out of place, made her stomach tighten. It was as if someone had positioned it there intentionally, as if it were meant to make the situation seem more ordinary than it really was. The sight of the car, so neat, so still, was almost more unsettling than anything else. Everything about it felt too controlled, too carefully curated. Jane stood there for a long moment, the silence of the parking lot pressing in on her, as if the world outside the gymnasium had somehow become more real, more immediate than the celebration unfolding inside. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about a missing person anymore. Something darker was unfolding, and it wasn't just the absence of Claire. It was the carefully crafted absence that spoke of something hidden, something deliberately concealed. As Jane turned to head back into the gym, her thoughts were still swirling, trying to piece together what she had just observed. The laughter and chatter from inside the gym now seemed distant, muted, like it was happening in another world. The noise of the reunion, once so familiar, had become out of tune, as if everything had subtly shifted beneath the surface. She entered the gymnasium once more, her eyes immediately scanning the room for any sign of Claire. Doug Hayes stood near the center of the floor, drink in hand, talking animatedly with a small group of classmates. His posture was stiff, his smile too wide. The former football star, once the pride of Ridgeway High, no longer commanded the same admiration. The confident swagger he used to carry seemed forced now, his eyes flickering nervously to the door, as if he was expecting someone, or something, to walk in at any moment. When Doug noticed Jane's gaze, his smile faltered. He quickly turned his attention to the others around him, as if dismissing her presence, but Jane could see the briefest flicker of unease in his eyes. Something was off. He seemed like a man trying to hold on to a past that was slipping away from him. Nearby, Maggie was in conversation with a few others. Jane couldn't hear them clearly, but she could read the tension in Maggie's body language. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes darting from person to person, but never staying too long on anyone in particular. She was too careful, too guarded. It wasn't just the words she said that Jane found unsettling. It was the way she was constantly measuring everything, reading the room as if trying to stay one step ahead. Then there was Linda. She had retreated to a quiet corner of the gym, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her gaze was downcast, but Jane could see the conflict in her posture. Linda was no longer the carefree girl who had once been Claire's best friend. The years had carved something else into her, something harder, more protective. She hadn't said much, but Jane could feel the weight of unspoken history between the two women, a history that had been buried for years. The tension between Linda and Claire was palpable, and Jane couldn't help but wonder what had happened between them, what had shattered the friendship that had once seemed so unbreakable. Jane's attention was drawn to the gymnasium doors when she saw something out of place, a slight movement, barely perceptible. She stepped toward the entrance, her heart beating a little faster. There, caught on the metal handle of the door, was a small piece of fabric. It was torn, the edges ragged, and its color was unmistakable, a deep blue, the same shade as Claire's dress. The fabric was barely visible, but Jane's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, her hand hovering over it before gently pulling it free. It was a clue, small, but it carried weight. The ragged tear spoke of a struggle, or at the very least, a hasty departure. The fabric seemed to pull at something deep inside Jane, a growing suspicion that the night's events were far more complicated than she had first believed. The noise of the reunion continued in the background, but for Jane, it had all become a dull hum, a noise too far removed from what was happening around her. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but she wasn't sure yet where they would lead. All she knew was that whatever was happening with Claire was not a simple disappearance. There was something much darker at play, and she was only beginning to understand the depth of it. The reunion buzzed around Jane, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the scattered bits of information she had gathered. Claire was still missing, and every passing moment without answers deepened the sense of unease in her chest. She wasn't just concerned about Claire's absence. She had the feeling that there was more lurking beneath the surface of this reunion than anyone was willing to admit. Jane needed more, a deeper understanding of the people here, beyond the small talk and polite exchanges. Jane had known many of these people in another life. They had been her students, and in her quiet way, she had observed them more than they probably realized. Time had changed them all. The familiar faces were marked by the years, but there was something different in their eyes now. Something that made Jane question who they had become, and more importantly, what they were hiding. One by one, Jane decided to approach her old classmates. She began with Maggie, who had positioned herself off to the side, her gaze flicking nervously to her phone. Maggie was a master of controlling her expressions, something Jane had always noticed, and tonight was no different. When Jane approached, Maggie's smile was too quick, not quite reaching her eyes. "Maggie," Jane began softly, her voice casual but probing, "I couldn't help but notice you seemed concerned earlier about Claire." Maggie's smile faltered for just a moment before she quickly recovered. Her eyes darted to the crowd, and her posture stiffened slightly. "It's just a little odd, don't you think? Claire vanishing like that. Always the drama queen." Jane studied Maggie, sensing that something more was hidden beneath her calm facade. She waited for Maggie to continue, but Maggie was quick to change the subject. "You two weren't exactly close, were you?" Jane asked, her tone pointed, but not unkind. Maggie hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the room before she shifted in her seat. She seemed to weigh whether or not to divulge more. Finally, she sighed and leaned in, her voice almost conspiratorial. "There was a time, a long time ago," Maggie began, her eyes now avoiding Jane's, "when Claire, well, she was involved with someone in our class. Mark Fields, football player, married. She nearly destroyed his marriage. The whole town knew about it, and after that, things were never the same." Maggie shook her head, her face briefly contorting with frustration. "The scandal was everywhere, but Claire, she just moved on, as though it never mattered." Jane didn't say anything, just waited, giving Maggie time to process what she had just shared. Maggie seemed to grow more agitated, her fingers tapping on her phone as though looking for something to anchor herself. "She never faced any consequences for what she did," Maggie continued, her voice tight with bitterness. "She ruined Mark's life. And now, I'm not surprised something's happened. She always got away with it, didn't she?" Jane nodded, processing the words carefully. It was a piece of the puzzle, one that painted Claire's past in a new light, as someone who used her charm and beauty without care for the consequences. But was it enough to explain her disappearance, or was there something else at play? Next, Jane turned her attention to Doug. He was standing near the bar, drink in hand, talking to a small group of classmates, but his focus was scattered. His eyes drifted across the room as though avoiding eye contact with anyone for too long. When he saw Jane approach, he stiffened, his posture rigid as though he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "Doug," Jane greeted him warmly, trying to ease the tension. "How've you been? Still keeping busy?" Doug grunted, taking a large sip of his drink and shrugging. "Been fine. You know how it is. Trying to make something work." Jane didn't push him, letting the awkward silence stretch out just long enough for him to fill it. Finally, he let out a frustrated sigh, his voice growing heavier as he spoke. "Claire, she got me into a bad investment years ago," Doug confessed, his words slow as if he were letting go of a long-held resentment. "I should have known better. Trusted her when I shouldn't have. It was supposed to be a sure thing. A big payout for both of us, but it fell apart, all my savings gone. And she didn't even blink, like it didn't matter." Doug's face darkened, his jaw clenching. "She ruined me, Jane, and I've never been able to forget it." Jane nodded thoughtfully, sensing the deep bitterness in his voice. There was more animosity in the air than Doug had let on at first. He had his reasons to resent Claire, but how far would that resentment go? Jane wasn't sure yet. Finally, Jane approached Linda. She had been sitting alone, her gaze fixed on the empty chair where Claire should have been. Linda had once been Claire's best friend, but now she seemed a stranger, distant, withdrawn, carrying a weight Jane couldn't quite understand. "Linda," Jane said gently, sitting beside her, "I know this must be difficult for you." Linda didn't look up immediately. her fingers twisted nervously around the hem of her sleeve, her eyes focused on the empty space in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though she wasn't sure if she should be saying anything at all. "Claire, she knew something about me," Linda began, her voice trembling slightly. "A secret from high school that no one else knew. She blackmailed me, Jane, for years. She used it against me. I couldn't say no to her. I was scared she'd tell everyone." Linda wiped her eyes quickly, refusing to let the tears fall. "I didn't know what to do. She was my best friend. But then she turned on me. She didn't care anymore. All she cared about was herself." Jane sat quietly, letting Linda's words settle. This wasn't just about a falling out between friends. It was about betrayal, deep, painful, and personal. The more Jane heard, the clearer it became. Claire's disappearance wasn't just some random act. It was tied to old wounds, things buried for years, only now coming to light. After the conversation, Jane felt the weight of the night bearing down on her. Everything seemed so tangled. Mistrust, resentment, secrets long buried. She walked away, feeling the puzzle pieces coming together, but not yet enough to see the full picture. As she walked back outside to Claire's car, the flyer from earlier gnawed at her mind. She picked it up again, running her fingers over the crinkled paper. As she flipped it over, she noticed something wedged beneath it, a small folded piece of paper. Carefully, she opened it, revealing the jagged handwriting. "The Queen always falls." The words echoed in her mind, a cryptic warning, as though someone knew exactly what was coming, or had already planned it. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but Jane still had more to uncover. She wasn't sure what the end would look like, but she knew this much. Whatever had happened to Claire, it was no coincidence. It had been a long time coming, and the secrets of Ridgeway High were far from finished. The morning after the reunion, Ridgeway was still sluggishly waking up from its late-night revelry when the news came. A janitor, walking his usual route around the school grounds, had stumbled upon Claire's body in a small wooded area just beyond the parking lot. Word spread quickly, first to the small group of early risers from the reunion, then to the entire town as the police arrived to cordon off the area. By the time the authorities had secured the scene and begun their investigation, the news had already reached every corner of the gathering. The mood in the gymnasium shifted from confusion to outright panic, and the faces that had been filled with curiosity the night before were now etched with fear. The police arrived in a steady stream, their flashing blue and red lights casting long shadows across the parking lot where Claire's car still sat, abandoned. The body was being examined, but the scene was already clear. There would be no easy answers. No one would be leaving the reunion anytime soon. Jane stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold, her mind already racing. Her earlier suspicions had been confirmed, but something else lingered, a gnawing uncertainty. This wasn't just a crime, it was a personal tragedy, tied to the tangled emotions and years of hidden relationships that had simmered beneath the surface of the reunion. Claire's death wasn't just a random act, it was deliberate. As the officers began their preliminary investigation, Jane moved toward the building to find Doug. She spotted him pacing near the entrance, his eyes darting nervously around the room. When he saw Jane, his face drained of color, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Have you heard?" Doug asked, his voice too loud, too sharp. "I can't believe it. Claire? Dead. Just like that." Jane didn't immediately respond. Instead, she studied him carefully, noting the tension in his movements. Doug's usual bravado had crumbled, and in its place was a man trying desperately to convince himself that everything was normal. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, clearly flustered. "I don't know what happened. I was just here last night, talking to people. I don't know where she went." Jane didn't press. She simply stood there watching him. The nervous energy that clung to him now wasn't present the night before. His eyes flickered toward the parking lot and quickly moved away, betraying an unease that went deeper than simple concern. The police had instructed everyone to remain inside the gym for the time being. Jane took the opportunity to observe the others. Maggie was sitting off to the side, her face pale and drawn. She was holding a glass of water, her fingers trembling slightly. Jane approached slowly, and when Maggie looked up, her gaze immediately shifted away, avoiding eye contact as if ashamed to be seen. I heard about Claire, Jane said gently, her voice calm. Are you okay? Maggie gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I don't know, she said slowly. I didn't expect this, but I guess I always knew something like this might happen. She shook her head, trying to reconcile her anger from the night before with the shock of the morning. Her voice faltered slightly. I told you about the affair, right? I told you Claire didn't care about anyone but herself. She ruined lives, and now look where it got her. Jane didn't speak immediately. She let Maggie's words settle between them, sensing the anger still boiling underneath. The years of resentment had hardened into something sharper, and now, even in the wake of Claire's death, Maggie couldn't shake the bitterness. Linda, too, was struggling with the news. She sat alone in a corner, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused, as though she were staring at nothing at all. Jane approached her carefully, knowing that Linda's relationship with Claire was fraught, complex, marked by things Jane could only guess at. Linda, Jane began gently, sitting beside her, I know this must be hard for you. Linda didn't look at Jane immediately. Her fingers were twisted in the hem of her sleeve, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, hesitant as if she were unsure whether to say anything at all. Claire, she knew something about me, Linda said, her voice tight, something I'd hoped would stay buried forever. She blackmailed me, Jane, with a secret from high school that no one else knew. She used it against me for years. I couldn't say no to her, not when she threatened to tell everyone. Linda's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, refusing to let them fall. She didn't care about me. She only cared about herself. She destroyed me, and I never forgave her. Jane sat quietly, processing Linda's words. This wasn't just the fallout of a broken friendship. It was betrayal, something far more personal. And now Linda's deep anger and pain seemed to have reached its breaking point. But had it been enough to kill Claire? Jane wasn't sure, but the pieces of the story were starting to fit together. The more Jane learned, the more complicated the motives became. As Jane turned to leave, she caught sight of Doug again. He was pacing nervously near the exit, his eyes darting around the room. He hadn't seen her yet, but his agitated movements didn't go unnoticed. There was something off about his behavior. He was avoiding eye contact, his foot tapping an anxious rhythm against the floor. Jane moved closer, her eyes shifting downward to his shoes. There was mud on them, dried, dark brown mud that looked far too fresh for someone who had been indoors for the past several hours. The texture matched the soil from the wooded area where Claire's body had been found. Doug, Jane said, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. Where were you last night, before the reunion ended? Doug stiffened. His hand gripped his drink tightly, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he muttered, I was just walking around. Took a walk. Needed some air. Jane didn't respond immediately. She just stood there watching him, her eyes locked on his. His face flushed with color, his gaze shifting nervously as if he knew that his own body was betraying him. The defensiveness in his posture, the evasiveness in his voice made it clear he wasn't telling the full truth. Funny, Jane said calmly, but it looks like you took a walk somewhere else. Doug's eyes widened. In that instant, Jane saw the guilt flash across his face before he quickly masked it with anger. What the hell is that supposed to mean? He snapped, his voice loud and defensive. I didn't do anything. I'm not the one who... He stopped, realizing his words had carried too far. His eyes turned away, swallowing hard, trying to regain control. The tension in the room had escalated to the breaking point. No one was pretending anymore. Claire's body had stripped away the false facades, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. Jane was sure of one thing. No one here, not one of them, was as innocent as they appeared. By late morning, the gymnasium had emptied out, and with it, the false sense of normalcy that had hung over the reunion. The air felt heavier now, thick with suspicion, every glance measuring the weight of unspoken words. The smiles that had once been forced were now more strained, each person trying desperately to keep up appearances. Jane's mind was a whirl of fragmented pieces, the conversations she'd had, the small details she'd observed. The answers she'd gotten so far had been full of half-truths, evasions, and lies. Each conversation only seemed to pull her deeper into a web she wasn't sure she could untangle. What was clear now was that Claire's death wasn't just a random act of violence. It was the result of years of resentment, history, pain, and unresolved anger that had finally boiled over. Jane couldn't shake the feeling that everything happening now was connected to something far deeper than a mere dispute or a chance meeting gone wrong. The tension between the classmates was palpable, like a thread ready to snap at any moment. Determined to get more answers, Jane moved from person to person, confronting them as directly as she could. Each time she spoke with someone, the answers were never quite what she expected, always filled with more questions, more gaps. But she pressed on, determined to piece together the puzzle, no matter how difficult or painful it might become. She found Linda sitting in a quiet corner, her face pale, her eyes staring into the distance, lost in thought. Linda had once been Claire's closest friend, but something had changed between them long ago. The bitterness between them now was as evident as it had ever been. Jane sat down beside her, speaking in a calm, measured tone. "I know you saw something last night, Linda," Jane began, cutting straight to the point. "You saw Claire arguing with someone near the parking lot. I need to know who it was." Linda didn't meet her gaze. Instead, she stared at the floor, her face tight with emotion. The words seemed caught in her throat, and Jane knew she wasn't ready to talk. But eventually, Linda whispered, barely above a breath. "It was Maggie. She was yelling at Claire. I couldn't hear everything, but it was obvious they were at odds." Jane's eyebrows furrowed. "Maggie? What was the argument about?" Linda shook her head, looking away. "I don't know, but it wasn't good. Maggie was furious." That was a new revelation. Maggie had seemed to play the role of the concerned classmate, the one who acted like she wanted to help. But now it appeared there was more animosity between her and Claire than anyone had realized. Jane's curiosity was piqued, and she couldn't help but wonder what had really happened between them over the years. Later, when Jane found Maggie sitting by the bar, nursing a drink, it was clear that the calm facade she had carefully cultivated was beginning to slip. The moment Jane approached and brought up the argument, Maggie's hand froze mid-sip, and for a brief instant, panic flashed across her face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by her usual indifference. "You argued with Claire last night?" Jane said, her voice firm but calm. "Linda saw you. What was that about?" Maggie set her drink down with a bit too much force. "I don't know what Linda saw, but it's nothing," she said quickly, her voice tight. "I was just... Claire. She was always so full of herself. I guess it got to me, you know. We had a disagreement. Nothing to get worked up about." But Jane wasn't buying it. Maggie was too quick to brush it off, and Jane knew there was more to the story. "I'm sure you don't mean the money she lent you?" Jane pressed, watching Maggie's face closely. For just a moment, Maggie's expression shifted, a fleeting hint of discomfort before she snapped, "I don't know what you're talking about." She forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Doug was the one with money problems, not me. It was a deflection, and Jane could see right through it. Maggie's defensiveness only deepened Jane's suspicion. There was something between her and Claire, something buried for years, something that had only now started to resurface. Before Jane could gather her thoughts, her gaze caught Gregory across the room. The quiet tech mogul, always on the periphery, now seemed out of place. He was acting differently, moving toward the exit with an anxious, almost panicked energy. His posture was stiff, and he looked as if he was trying to avoid notice, but there was no mistaking the way he was hurrying toward the door. "Gregory," Jane called, stepping toward him. He froze, his face draining of color as he turned to face her. For a brief moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by a nervous energy that raised Jane's suspicions even further. "What's going on?" she asked bluntly. "Why are you leaving so soon? You don't even seem surprised by what's happened." Gregory shifted uneasily on his feet. "I'm just tired," he muttered, forcing a nervous laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Long night, you know?" Jane wasn't convinced. "You don't look tired. You look like you're trying to get out of here as fast as possible. Is there something you're not telling me?" Gregory hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously around the room. "It's not what you think," he stammered. "Someone's been blackmailing me. I can't stay here. They said if I didn't leave, they'd..." He cut himself off, his voice cracking under the strain. Blackmail? Jane repeated, her voice laced with suspicion. Who? Gregory's eyes darted around the room, his whole body shrinking as though he wished he could disappear. I'm sorry, I can't talk about it, he said quickly, almost pleading. I have to go. Without waiting for a response, he rushed out the door, leaving Jane standing there, more perplexed than ever. The words blackmail echoed in her mind as she processed what she had just heard. What could Gregory have to hide? Was he involved? And why hadn't he stayed to answer questions? His hasty departure only added to Jane's growing sense that something was very wrong. Later that day, as Jane returned to the gym to clear her head, something caught her eye. A stack of old class photos, prom pictures from the night Claire had been crowned queen, lay scattered on one of the tables. As she flipped through them, one photograph caught her attention immediately. A picture of Claire from that night, smiling proudly. But what stood out was the mark on the back of the photo, something written in red ink, "Justice for Rachel." The words stood stark against the fading photograph, the handwriting jagged and angry. Rachel. The girl who had died so mysteriously years ago. Jane had always known Claire had been linked to Rachel's downfall, but she had never known the full story. Now it seemed that Rachel's death had come back to haunt Claire, and this wasn't just a random message. It was a cry for retribution. As Jane absorbed the words, everything seemed to fall into place. The phrase, "Justice for Rachel," was not just an old grudge. It was the motive. The past had caught up with Claire, and now it seemed there were many who had waited for this day to come. The web was tightening, and Jane knew that the motive for Claire's death had been decades in the making. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became. Someone was using the past to exact justice, and Claire had been the one to pay the price. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place. Jane could feel the weight of it now, the pressure building as everything she had uncovered began to align. The emotions, the resentment, the long-buried secrets, each one connected, leading her towards something far darker than she had anticipated. It wasn't just about Claire's disappearance anymore. It wasn't merely about the resurfacing of old grudges and pain. The truth, Jane realized, lay deeper than she could have imagined. It had always been about Rachel's death. The key to Claire's role in it and the involvement of many others in Ridgeway had been buried under years of silence. Rachel, the quiet girl who had never quite fit in, who had been pushed to the edge of their group, ostracized by her classmates and tormented by whispers, and the tragic death that had been dismissed by the town as a mere accident when, in fact, it was the result of a deliberate cruelty, a cruelty Claire had started long before Rachel's life unraveled. The rumors had started with Claire, of course. Jane had always suspected it, but now she had the confirmation. Rachel had been the target of a malicious rumor, a story, false and vicious, that Claire had spread to ruin her. Rachel had been a quiet, sensitive soul, and when the story took hold, it tore her apart. The isolation, the shame, it all fed into her eventual tragic end. Rachel's life, once promising, was shattered by that single act of cruelty. She had been abandoned by her peers, rejected, and ultimately, when everything became too much, Rachel's tragic death, an accident the town chose to forget, was directly caused by the pain Claire had inflicted. Jane stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of it. This wasn't just high school drama. It was a tragedy that had been festering for years. The hurt, the guilt, and the anger had been buried, but now they were all coming to the surface. Claire's past sins had caught up with her, and now it seemed the people she had wronged would make her face those sins. As Jane sifted through the last of the yearbooks and the scattered papers, a clear pattern emerged. There was no escaping it now. The killer had been in front of her all along, Linda. The realization hit Jane like a blow to the chest. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was Linda, the one person who had never forgiven Claire, the one person whose grief and rage had festered for years. It made sense now. Linda had staged the drama at the reunion. She had been waiting for this moment, hoping to confront Claire, to finally make her own reckoning. When Claire had dismissed Linda's pain, when she refused to acknowledge what she had done, Linda's emotions had boiled over. In that moment, Linda's grief turned into something far more dangerous. Linda had killed Claire. The killer wasn't some outsider or some chance encounter. The murderer was someone who had known Claire intimately, someone who had once loved her, someone who had been betrayed. It was Linda who had taken matters into her own hands. This wasn't a random fit of anger. It was a twisted form of justice for Rachel, a justice that had been denied for far too long. Jane couldn't shake the image of Linda from her mind. She had always been distant, cold, and now Jane understood why. That coldness had always been a defense mechanism, but now Jane saw it for what it truly was, a mask for years of pain. And now that mask was slipping away. Jane knew where Linda would be. She could feel it. The old locker room, that place where Rachel's belongings had been kept, still held remnants of her. It was where everything had started to fall apart for Rachel, and it was where everything would come to light now. When Jane entered the locker room, she saw Linda standing at the far end, her back turned to her. Linda was holding something tightly in her hands, her fingers trembling. She looked down as though not wanting to be seen. "Linda," Jane called softly, taking a slow step forward. Linda froze, her body stiffening. For a moment she didn't move, as if unsure of how to respond. Slowly she turned to face Jane, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were bloodshot, and Jane could see the struggle in her expression. It was as though she had been expecting this moment, and now that it had arrived, there was no escaping it. "You know why I'm here," Jane said gently, her voice steady, filled with certainty. "You know what you did." Linda's eyes flickered with emotion, a momentary flash of regret that quickly vanished, replaced by something harder, colder. She took a shaky breath, and when she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had to do it," she said, the words thick with emotion. "I couldn't let her get away with it. Not after what she did to Rachel. Not after all these years of living with that pain. She destroyed Rachel's life, and then she just went on with hers like nothing happened. She never even apologized." Linda's face crumpled, the mask of coldness slipping away. Raw grief was left in its place. Rachel was my best friend. She didn't deserve what Claire did to her. She didn't deserve to die the way she did. And Claire, she never even cared. I couldn't let her get away with it. Not again. Tears streamed down Linda's face, her hands trembling as she finally dropped them to her sides. The weight of everything she had carried for so long was spilling out in that moment. Years of anger, sorrow, and regret were coming to the surface, and Linda could no longer hold them in. "I wanted her to face what she had done," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible. "But when she wouldn't listen, when she brushed me off like I was nothing, I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't." Jane stood there in silence for a long moment, letting Linda's confession settle. There was no anger left in Linda's voice now, only the overwhelming weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. It wasn't justice. It was an act of broken grief, a grief that had festered for years until it had consumed everything. "I'm sorry," Linda said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know what else to do." Jane's heart ached with the weight of it, but there was nothing left to be done. Linda had already confessed, and now there was no turning back. The past had come full circle, and the cost had been high. "I know," Jane said softly, her voice filled with quiet understanding. "I know." The morning light filtered weakly through the dusty windows of Ridgeway High, casting long, distorted shadows across the gymnasium. The echoes of the previous night's chaos still lingered in the air, but the room was now eerily quiet, empty except for a few scattered cups, half-empty water bottles, and forgotten name tags. What was meant to be a celebration of time, of rekindled friendships, had instead unraveled a dark secret long buried in the town's past. The whispers had died down, but the weight of the events still hung heavily in the room, undeniable and suffocating. Linda Shaw had been arrested just hours earlier. Her confession had come like a quiet storm, sweeping through Ridgeway with a force no one could have anticipated. Her face had been pale and devoid of emotion as she was led away by the police, her eyes empty and distant. There were no protests, no desperate cries of innocence, just the heavy silence of a woman who had for years bottled up an unbearable rage and sorrow. The classmates who had once known her as Claire's closest friend now looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and pity. The reality of it had settled in fast. One of their own had taken another's life, and no amount of reminiscing or laughing over old memories could erase the harsh truth that had come to light. The reunion attendees were still in shock. A few had left early, their departure swift and silent, the weight of the revelation too much to bear. Others lingered in quiet groups, exchanging hushed words, casting uncertain glances at one another. In the end, there was nothing left to say. The reunion, intended to be a celebration of old times, had turned into a sobering reminder of how deeply buried resentments can fester over the years, only to surface when least expected. Outside, the world carried on, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded within the walls of Ridgeway High. But inside, nothing would ever be the same. The years of nostalgia, of fond memories, had been tainted, irreparably altered by the brutal truth that had been uncovered. Jane sat alone in a small corner of the gym, her pen moving slowly across a piece of paper. The events of the past few days played over and over in her mind. Secrets uncovered, relationships shattered, the painful history of this town finally laid bare for everyone to see. She wrote a letter to Rachel's family, offering the closure they had been denied for so long. She didn't know if it would bring them peace, but she hoped it would bring them some understanding of the truth. The letter was simple, just a few words, but it felt like the right thing to do, an attempt to right a wrong that had been ignored for too long. As she sealed the envelope, her thoughts drifted back to the reunion. The faces of her classmates still lingered in her mind, each one carrying the weight of their own personal histories. Some had found success, others had fallen from grace, but none of them were untouched by the passage of time. The reunion had been a mirror, reflecting not only who they had been in high school, but who they had become in the years since. She stood up, her gaze shifting toward the back of the gym, where the old yearbook lay on a table. She walked over, her fingers brushing lightly across the yellowed pages. She paused, staring at the faces of the people who had once filled these halls, young, full of promise, unaware of the paths their lives would take. Jane ran her hand over the photographs, tracing the names of the people who had shaped her world. But what struck her most were the gaps, names crossed out, faces erased from memory, the spaces that marked the loss of people who had been forgotten, the secrets that had been buried, the stories left untold. Jane closed the yearbook slowly, her thoughts racing with a single question. How many more secrets were hidden in these pages, waiting to be uncovered? The past had a way of shaping the present, of holding people in its grip long after the memories had faded. Jane knew deep down that in this town there would always be stories that remained untold and mysteries that would never be solved. Even though the truth about Claire's death had been brought to light, there would always be more to discover. More stories left untold, more secrets buried beneath the surface. As Jane walked to the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet gym, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past was never truly gone. It lingered, just out of reach, like a shadow that refused to fade. And as she stepped into the bright sunlight outside, she realized that some things, some stories, would never truly be put to rest. The world would move on, as it always did. But Ridgeway would always carry its secrets, its ghosts, its lost memories. And for Jane, the question remained, how many more secrets were buried within its pages? And would anyone ever be brave enough to uncover them?